Emily had always been the type of person who contained storms within. A nurse by vocation, she knew how to move through hospital corridors as naturally as she breathed. Accustomed to seeing human fragility up close, she thought nothing could surprise her after years of comforting patients, calming family members, and attending silent farewells. But nothing prepared her for the diagnosis from Daniel, her husband, the man who built with his own hands the house in which they dreamed of growing old. Severe aplastic anemia. 3 words that sounded like a verdict in a far too cold room. Despite her medical knowledge, Emily suddenly felt small, helpless, as if the ground beneath her feet no longer existed. They lived on the outskirts of Nashville, in a wooden cabin with a wide porch and swings that creaked in the wind. There, among pine trees and dirt roads, they imagined a simple life, with barefoot children running through the yard and long afternoons sharing silence. Daniel, a carpenter, with weathered hands and a serene soul, had built that home with a vision of a future filled with laughter. But the illness peeled away layers of that. His skin lost color, his energy was fading, and Emily, despite her professional training, didn't know how to save him. She was torn between being a wife and being a nurse, between clinging to hope and accepting the inevitable. Daniel had been adopted as a child and had never met his biological family. That missing piece, which for years had been merely an anecdotal fact, now became the biggest barrier. A bone marrow transplant was her only real chance, but with no known relatives, finding a compatible donor was like searching for a drop in the ocean. Emily organized campaigns, called for volunteers, and consulted donor banks. No matches. Only cold statistics that spoke of urgency and the running out of time. Every refusal, every failed test broke her down inside, even though she feigned strength on the outside. The last meeting with the doctor was a shock without any anesthesia. In a calm but straightforward voice, the hematologist admitted that they were running out of options. Daniel was entering a critical phase. As she left that appointment, Emily felt something inside her finally break. She wandered aimlessly through the hospital corridors, avoided eye contact, went through the back door of the emergency room, and stood alone, trying to breathe between sobs. It was there, amid the smell of disinfectant and the hum of ambulances, that she accidentally overheard 2 nurses talking. One of them said something that, had she not been in that emotional state, would have gone unnoticed. "He looks so much like that man from Pine Hollow, right down to his eyes." And that phrase, insignificant to anyone, lit a spark in the darkest depths of her despair. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She mentally replayed every word of that overheard conversation, as if she could extract some hidden message between the lines. At dawn, without telling anyone, she got in her car and drove to Pine Hollow, a tiny town a little over an hour away. She didn't play any music. She didn't take any calls. The silence in the vehicle was thick, broken only by the sound of the engine and her racing heartbeat. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, perhaps a face, a coincidence, something crazy. But something inside her, a gut feeling, told her she should see it through. Pine Hollow seemed stuck in another decade. Narrow streets, shops with dusty display windows, a wooden bench in front of the barber shop where 2 elderly men were chatting as if time were in no hurry. Emily walked into an old-fashioned hardware store where a thin man with a faded hat was serving behind the counter. She discreetly showed him a photo of Daniel. The man studied it closely, frowning. "He looks like this Luke Henderson," he drawled. "He lives up on the hill but comes down occasionally to buy planks." The name made Emily's stomach clench. She gave a quick nod of thanks and left, her heart pounding. The road up the hill was made of loose dirt and sharp turns, flanked by tall trees that cast irregular shadows. Upon arriving, a wooden house appeared among the bushes, simple and solitary, with an old pickup truck parked alongside. Emily got out of the car on shaky legs and knocked cautiously on the door, unsure of how to explain if she was mistaken. When the man opened it, for a second she thought Daniel had gotten out of bed. He had. The same intense blue eyes, the same set of jaw, even the same squint. But his expression was different, more hardened, as if time had sculpted invisible scars. Emily introduced herself bluntly and, with emotional awkwardness, told him everything. Her illness, her desperate search, the conversation she overheard, and the possibility, however remote, that he was her husband's biological brother. Luke listened to her silently, without interrupting, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her as if trying to read beyond her words. When she finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then he spoke in a deep voice, like someone digging into a buried memory. My mother had another son. She told me once that she left him in the hospital when he was a baby. I never heard anything more. The ensuing silence wasn't empty. It was dense. And in the midst of that silence, something in Luke began to decide. Luke didn't ask for time to think or consult anyone. He simply asked Emily to wait for him. A moment, went into the house, and came out with an old jacket and a small, crumpled notebook. Let's go, he said, and without further ado, they got in the car on the way to the hospital. During the drive, they spoke little. Emily told him more details about Daniel, how they met, what his laugh was like, the things he built with his hands, and the fear that had settled in their home for months. Luke listened, his eyes lost in the landscape, as if each word drew an internal map he needed to memorize. He never said whether he was afraid or had doubts. He only clenched his fists from time to time, as if he were facing something very ancient. Upon arriving at the hospital, the procedures were swift. The medical team, initially skeptical, was shocked by the physical resemblance between the two men. Urgent tests were performed, and Emily spent the next few hours in a kind of trance, pacing the halls, sitting down, standing up, checking her cell phone even though she wasn't expecting any messages. When the results were finally delivered, tears began to fall before she could even read them completely. A complete match. Luke was a perfect donor. The emotion was so intense that she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. There was a new possibility, a lifeline no one expected. The operation was scheduled immediately. Daniel, though weak, smiled for the first time in weeks when he saw Luke. He didn't ask much, didn't make a big deal out of it. He just looked at him, with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, as if his body knew before his mind that something important was happening. Luke, for his part, didn't try to explain anything. He just sat beside him and told him about his house in Pine Hollow, how squirrels stole the nuts he kept on the porch, and an old song his mother used to hum when it rained. Thus began, effortlessly, a connection that went beyond DNA. The transplant was a success. Although the following days were critical, Daniel responded well to the treatment. Emily, who hadn't allowed herself to fall apart up to that point, finally truly cried. A cry without restraint, of relief, of delayed fear, of accumulated gratitude. Luke would stay for hours in the room, reading old books he found in the waiting room, and every time he went in to see Daniel, he did so with the same silent respect of someone visiting something sacred. Little by little, what began as an act of generosity transformed into something deeper. There were gestures, glances, shared silences that only two siblings, though separated by life, could understand. When Daniel was discharged weeks later, he was no longer the same man who had been admitted in critical condition. There was a new calm in his eyes, as if suffering had revealed something essential to him. Emily noticed it in small details, in the way he stared at the sunrise from the window without saying a word, or in the way he held her hand more often, as if needing reassurance that they were still there, together. Luke, for his part, didn't leave. He stayed in Nashville for a few more days, sleeping on a mattress on the living room floor, saying it was just in case, but no one asked him to leave. On the contrary, his presence brought something warm, unexpected. One evening, the three of them were having dinner together on the terrace. The air smelled of freshly cut wood and damp earth. Luke talked about how he'd taught himself carpentry by watching a neighbor during his childhood. Daniel, almost as if by reflex, began talking to him about the same materials, the same tools, as if they shared memories they hadn't known they had. Emily watched them silently, with a mixture of tenderness and wonder. In that instant, she understood that what united them wasn't just genetics, but a kind of vital resonance, a common frequency that had been taken from them at birth, but that fate had endeavored to restore. As the months passed, Luke became part of the everyday landscape. He helped Daniel with small repairs around the house, cooked huge country breakfasts, and without realizing it, had become the makeshift uncle that Emily and Daniel's children would one day meet. Although no one said it out loud, everyone knew that connection was no coincidence. It was as if the universe, in its mysterious clumsiness, had woven an impossible path just for that moment to happen. Emily returned to the hospital where she worked, but she was no longer the same nurse. She carried something deeper in her eyes, as if she had touched an invisible edge of life. There were days when she was still afraid that the illness would return, that her luck would change, that it had all been a mirage. But in those moments, all she had to do was look at Daniel making coffee while humming a silly tune, or watch Luke mending the garden fence without saying a word. There was a new beauty in simplicity. Emily understood that not all miracles come with noise or dramatic lights. Some come in the form of absurd coincidences, phrases overheard, faces repeated in unexpected places. And that sometimes lives are saved not with scalpels or science, but with love and an intuition that refuses to give up. A year after the transplant, Daniel and Luke built a small workshop together behind the house. It was a modest space, with large windows and the constant smell of freshly sanded wood. There they spent hours talking quietly and sharing long silences that spoke louder than words. Sometimes Emily would sit in the doorway with a cup of tea, watching the two of them measure, cut, and joke quietly, as if they had been brothers all their lives. That workshop became a symbol of what they had rebuilt, not just a life, but a new story. A story no one would have believed possible at the edge of a hospital bed. Emily continued working long shifts, but her approach to other people's pain had changed. She was no longer so quick to offer answers or try to console with cliches. She knew from her own experience that sometimes all someone needs is to know there's another possibility, no matter how remote it may seem. Her story with Daniel and Luke began to circulate in the hospital, first as a whisper among nurses and then as an inspiration to other patients waiting for impossible donors. Without intending to, Emily became a symbol of quiet persistence. There was one thing no one could deny. This reunion had healed wounds none of the three knew they had. Luke, who had lived almost his entire life alone, discovered the warmth of a shared table. Daniel, who once thought he had no roots, found a mirror in which he could look without fear. And Emily, who had spent months feeling helpless, understood that love can also be action, even when all seems lost. None of them were the same again. And that, far from being a loss, was the greatest gain life had offered them. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves fell like golden rain over the garden, Emily found Daniel asleep in the hammock and Luke snoring in a canvas chair, a half-finished beer in his hand. She looked at them and felt something she didn't know how to name. It wasn't just peace, it was fulfillment. In the midst of all the chaos, all the fear, all the suffering they'd been through, they'd found a place to stay. They didn't need grand plans or cosmic explanations. Just that. To be alive, to be together, and to know that against all odds, they'd started over. Over time, Luke began to talk more openly about his childhood. He didn't do so with sadness, but with the harsh honesty of someone who has learned to live with scars. He told of growing up in foster homes, learning not to get attached to anyone, and spending more than one Christmas alone, eating in soup kitchens. Emily listened attentively, without interrupting, understanding more and more why this man moved through life as if he expected nothing. But she also noticed that something had changed in him. Now, when someone hugged him, he didn't stay still. He responded. And when he laughed, he did so without looking around, as if he no longer expected happiness to suddenly slip away. Daniel also changed. He gradually returned to work, first from home, designing simple furniture, and then resuming local commissions. Neighborhood residents, who had followed his story closely, began to visit him more frequently. Not out of pity, but out of admiration. They wanted to see with their own eyes the man who had returned from the dead, saved by an almost impossible coincidence. Daniel, who never sought attention, accepted these visits with humility. But at night, when they were alone together, A suppressed emotion was evident, as if he couldn't quite believe what they were experiencing. Emily kept a diary. It wasn't a neat notebook filled with elaborate phrases, just scattered notes, loose thoughts, emotions she couldn't say out loud. On one of those pages, she wrote something she never showed to anyone. "The day I thought I was losing him, I heard an absurd phrase that saved me. Sometimes God doesn't shout. His miracles whisper from a hospital room." And it was true. There was never a grand announcement nor an absolute certainty, just a chain of improbable events that fit together like loose pieces of a seemingly incomplete puzzle. One night, after dinner, Luke approached Emily while she was washing dishes and said something that left her motionless for seconds. "Thank you for finding me." There was no immediate response, only silence. She turned around, her eyes brimming with tears, and hugged him. Not as a sister-in-law or a nurse or a savior. She hugged him as someone who, without seeking it, had become part of her story, her home, her heart. That gesture closed an invisible circle. They were no longer three people united by tragedy. They were family. Not everything was easy after his recovery. There were days when Daniel woke up with nightmares, reliving the darkest hours of his hospitalization. Sometimes he would get up silently in the middle of the night and walk to the workshop just to touch the wood with his hands, as if he needed to confirm it was still there. Luke accompanied him without questions. He would sit nearby, light an old lamp, and carve in silence. They didn't need to talk. That kind of silent companionship without pressure or promises was more powerful than any words. Emily watched them from the window, hugging herself, knowing that some pain only heals with time and presence. One particularly cold autumn, Luke decided to return to Pine Hollow for a while to resolve unfinished business. The farewell was simple, without drama. "I'll be back soon," he said. And so it was. He returned a few weeks later with a box of old photos and a worn notebook where his mother had apparently written fragments of her life. Between the pages, they found a loose leaf with the name Daniel scribbled in the margin. No one cried. There was no need to. It was a confirmation. They didn't need, but one that tenderly healed an old wound. It was as if the past finally gave them permission to move on without guilt. Over the years, the workshop became a space shared by more than just them. Neighbors, friends, and even neighborhood children would come to learn, to hear stories, or simply to watch the Carter brothers, as people began to call them, work. They never corrected the surname. They adopted it as their own, without question. Daniel and Luke had been separated at birth by circumstances they would never fully understand, but had been reunited by a chain of events that defied all logic. Emily, deep down, knew that not all threads of fate can be explained, but some can be honored. One day, Emily found Daniel writing in the diary she used to keep. It was the first time she'd ever seen him do so. He closed the notebook with a shy smile and left it on the table. Later, when she opened it out of curiosity, she found a single sentence written in firm handwriting. "I was close to giving up, but she never did it for me." Emily read those words silently, her heart heavy and her throat tight, and she understood that, despite everything, they had made it. Together, in their own way, with mistakes, with fear, but also with a love so real that it was able to rewrite a destiny that seemed already written. There was a moment, shortly after the transplant, when Daniel completely broke down. It was one afternoon when Emily found him sitting on the bathroom floor, clutching his knees, trembling. He said nothing. She knelt in front of him and held his face with both hands. There was a mixture of shame and terror in her eyes that needed no explanation. "I don't want you to live for my illness," he murmured, barely audible. It was the only time Emily raised her voice. "I don't live for your illness, Daniel. I live for us." That moment was a turning point, not because the pain disappeared, but because they were no longer carrying it alone. For weeks, Emily had to re-educate herself emotionally. She had learned to care for bodies, but now she had to learn to sustain souls in the process of rebuilding. Days at home were a combination of fear and gratitude. They cooked together even though Daniel tired quickly. They watched movies they already knew by heart, and they talked about everything, except the future. That topic for a while hung in the air, like a blank page that dared not be written on. It was Luke who one day, while chopping wood, said bluntly, "We have to stop living in anticipation of bad news." And with that simple phrase, he gave them back the right to plan. There were visits to the lake, short trips to nearby towns, impromptu dinners with friends who had previously been hesitant to come over. Emily realized that life was slowly returning, not with bursts of joy, but with humble details. The sound of spontaneous laughter, a tension-free good morning, the habit of making coffee for 3 instead of 2. Luke was no longer a guest. There were his clothes in the closet, tools marked with his initials in the workshop, and photographs where he appeared naturally, as if he'd always been there. No one questioned his place. He'd earned it with generous silences, with a steady presence, with unflappable love. One spring morning, Emily found an old letter among Daniel's adoption papers. It was addressed, "To the baby I couldn't keep," and signed with a name Luke instantly recognized. It was from his mother. In the letter, she apologized with heartbreaking honesty, explaining her extreme poverty and the fear of raising 2 children alone, less than a year apart in age. Emily read it aloud, her hands shaking, while Daniel and Luke listened in complete silence. When she finished, no one cried. They just looked at each other, as if recognizing a shared grief that finally had closure. Sometimes, what cannot be repaired can be understood. After that letter, Luke began to write too. He didn't do it like someone keeping a diary, but like someone who needs to unearth things he can't say out loud. He jotted down fragmented memories, scattered scenes from his childhood, unanswered questions, and above all, things he would have liked to tell Daniel if they had known each other as children. One day, he left a folded sheet of paper on the workshop table. Daniel found it by chance and read it silently. It was a short text, clumsy in places, but so genuine that it made a lump form in his throat. "I always thought I had no one, but now I have you, and that's enough." From then on, the two began exchanging written words, as if by doing so they could mend lost time. Emily, who at first only read those notes from afar, without intervening, ended up becoming part of the exchange. She posted short phrases on the refrigerator, some sweet, others ironic, that made them both laugh. It was a way of saying, "Here we are, together, still." The house was filled with slips of paper, pieces of soul, scattered among furniture, frames, and mirrors. Each written word was a way of healing what life hadn't allowed to grow at the time. And with each line, the three of them reinforced something that was already evident. The past couldn't be changed, but the present could be a collective work. One of the things that most transformed Emily was seeing how Daniel and Luke became reflections of each other. Not just physically, but in their gestures, habits, and ways of thinking. Sometimes they would finish each other's sentences without meaning to, or laugh at things she didn't fully understand. Far from feeling excluded, Emily experienced it as an unexpected gift. She, who had believed she was going to lose the love of her life, now shared her days with 2 men who, without planning it, had rebuilt a story that seemed broken from the beginning. And that couldn't be explained with science or logic. It was simply the power of being in the right place, with an open heart. As time passed, Daniel wanted to know more about his biological mother, not out of a need for blame, but out of curiosity. Emily and Luke supported him in that process. They searched archives, spoke with former social workers, and eventually managed to find a distant aunt who still lived in a neighboring county. The visit was brief, without any great revelations, but it was enough for Daniel to feel like he was closing a cycle. He returned home in silence, and that evening, while they were having dinner on the porch, he said something that resonated like a long sigh. "I don't judge her. She did her best. But now I understand that what matters is not how a story begins, but how we choose to write the rest." Daniel, Emily, and Luke's story began to resonate beyond their inner circle. A local journalist, who had heard about the case from a hospital nurse, asked permission to interview them. At first, they were hesitant. They weren't interested in exposure, nor did they want to romanticize such a difficult experience. But then they realized that perhaps their story could inspire others who were on the verge of giving up. They agreed. The interview was published in a regional newspaper under the headline, "Finding Oneself in the Midst of the Impossible." The article went viral. People from all over the country wrote messages of support, sharing similar stories of estranged siblings, rare illnesses, and leaps of faith. Among the messages, there was one that particularly moved them. A woman who had decided not to give up searching for her biological sister after reading her testimony. Another came from a young adoptee who confessed that he felt, for the first time, that his story was not a condemnation, but a possibility. Emily, who had never sought the spotlight, began receiving invitations to speak at medical conferences on bone marrow donation, and adoptive family gatherings. Every time she took the stage, she did so trembling, but she spoke with the raw, warm truth that only someone who has endured darkness possesses. Daniel and Luke would sometimes accompany her. They didn't always speak, but their presence was enough. It was like saying, "Yes, this happened, and here we are." Once at a medical school, a student asked Emily what her most difficult moment had been. She took a deep breath, looked at them both, and said, "It wasn't the diagnosis. It was continuing to believe when everything said no." That phrase stuck with many of those present. Because sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting, but continuing to hope when the fight seems hopeless. As time passed, life returned to a more normal, more everyday life. But that normalcy no longer had the same flavor. Every breakfast, every birthday, every rainy afternoon had a new density, an awareness of the value of simplicity. They had gone from living in survival mode to living with presence. Emily noticed how even the silences were different now. They no longer hurt. They were comfortable. Spaces of shared peace. There were days when the past returned in the form of an image, a smell, a song. But it no longer took their breath away. It only served to remind them that they had been there, and had been together. One Sunday afternoon, while Daniel was cleaning paintbrushes in the workshop and Luke was organizing nails by size, an obsessive habit that everyone had warmly accepted, Emily found a forgotten box in the attic of the house. It was full of old photographs, many of them unidentified. But among them, one image appeared that made her stop. A baby wrapped in a blue blanket, held by a woman with a melancholy look. On the back, in a nearly erased pencil, was the inscription, "Daniel, a few weeks before goodbye." Emily ran downstairs with the photo in her hand, held it in front of Daniel, and without saying a word, they both knew they didn't need any more proof or explanation. The image was the final piece of a puzzle they had put together with faith. Luke framed the photo and hung it in the workshop right above the bench where they both worked. Not out of nostalgia, but as a way of acknowledging everything that wasn't said, everything that wasn't experienced, but that now had a worthy place. It was a silent reminder that sometimes stories are reconstructed in a different order, and that there's no age limit for starting over. Over time, that workshop became almost a sanctuary, a space for creation, for laughter, and also for tears that no one judged. Furniture was born there, but promises were also born there. The most important one, take care of yourself, no matter what happens. Daniel's health remained stable. Although doctors remained cautious, quarterly checkups showed a solid recovery. Luke, meanwhile, began taking advanced carpentry courses and was invited on more than one occasion to teach traditional techniques to vulnerable youth. Emily, with a calmer heart, began studying family psychology at night, convinced that her experience could become a tool for others. They were no longer living just for themselves. They were living for something greater. For that something that can only be understood after having come very close to losing everything. Birthdays were now sacred celebrations. Not because of the number of guests or the gifts, but because each year represented a personal victory. Daniel's first birthday after the transplant was a simple dinner, with candles, homemade cake, and a handwritten note from Luke. "I never knew I had a brother, but now I don't know what life would be like without him." Emily, who had silently prepared everything, burst into tears when she read it. It wasn't sadness. It was that strange emotion that mixes gratitude, relief, and a little disbelief at the way life sometimes repairs the irreparable. That winter, the house was filled with postcards. People from all over sent letters addressed to the brothers who met at the right time. Some were grateful, others offered hope, and some even asked for advice or simply shared similar stories. Emily began to store each letter in a wooden box carved by Daniel, with the word miracles written on the lid. Not out of religion, but out of respect. For them, each message was a reminder that what they had experienced had not been in vain. That even the most devastating pain can generate something beautiful, if embraced honestly. One day, Daniel suggested organizing a community donation drive. Emily contacted the hospital, and Luke spoke with the neighbors, many of whom already knew her story. What began as a simple idea grew into an event filled with music, home-cooked food, and lines of people eager to sign up as bone marrow donors. That afternoon, as the sun set behind the trees and warm lights illuminated the porch, Emily realized they were experiencing something they had never dared to imagine. A second chance that was not only theirs, but shared. After that day, the house was once again filled with activity. They received constant visits from friends, curious onlookers, and people who simply wanted to meet those who had made something so improbable possible. But amid all this new energy, the most valuable remained the everyday. The simple meals, the walks in the woods, the nights of shared silence. Emily understood that true healing comes not from grand gestures, but from the small habits that become rituals of love. And in that serene rhythm, life found its natural course again. One afternoon, as they walked along the path behind the house, Luke stopped in front of a huge tree and carved 3 initials into the bark. D+E+L. He said nothing. Emily and Daniel looked at him and smiled. They needed no translation. Those letters represented everything they had lived through, everything they had endured, and everything they were still building. It wasn't a romantic tribute or a mark for posterity. It was a simple, intimate act, like everything they had learned to value since grief taught them to look with different eyes. As the years passed, each of them found a different way to tell their story. Daniel did it with his hands. Each piece of furniture he built bore a small, hidden inscription, a key word that only Emily and Luke knew. It was his way of leaving a mark without words. Emily, on the other hand, wrote short stories based on patients she had met. She didn't reveal names or details, but each text carried within it an essence, a lesson, a reflection of what she had experienced. Luke began taking photographs, many of them in black and white, capturing simple moments: a steaming cup, an empty chair, a backlit hug. In this way, the 3 of them kept the memory of their rebirth alive. On one of those quiet afternoons, Emily suggested planting a tree in the garden, not as a symbol of what they had overcome, but as a promise of all they still had to live. They chose a young oak, strong and supple. They planted it together without any arguments, just with hands full of soil and calm hearts. Beside it, they placed a stone with a date, the day Daniel received the marrow. Every year, on that same day, they shared a meal under the tree, even if it rained. It was their ritual, their way of honoring life without lapsing into solemnity. Somewhere along the way, they stopped wondering what would have happened if they hadn't heard that phrase in the hospital, if Emily hadn't followed her instinct, if Luke hadn't opened the door. They learned not to live in hypotheticals. They preferred the now, that present built with layers of pain, courage, and silent love. The story was still alive, but it no longer hurt. It had become a root, a firm foundation on which they could lean when the world was shaking. And although difficult days still came, because no one emerges completely unscathed from a battle like this, they no longer faced them alone. They faced them as a family. Not a perfect or traditional family, but a chosen one, forged from chaos, loss, and resilience. Emily, Daniel, and Luke learned that not all bonds are created in childhood, nor do all miracles come clothed in light. Some arrive as a whisper, a coincidence, a door that opens at just the right moment. And when that happens, the only thing left to do is dare to walk through it. Years later, When life had finally found its rhythm, with rainy afternoons on the terrace, with the laughter of children running among tools and wood shavings, Emily realized that the story they had lived no longer hurt when she remembered it. There were scars, yes, but also light. Not everything healed, but everything was transformed. There was love in every corner of that house, in every daily gesture, in every cup of coffee shared at dawn. Daniel still had regular medical checkups, and Luke continued to visit Pine Hollow from time to time. But the essential remained intact. They had found each other, and with that, they had all rescued each other. Because in the end, the story of Emily, Daniel, and Luke wasn't just about a rare disease or a miraculous coincidence. It was a story of life-saving intuitions, of leaps of faith in the midst of despair, of people who become homes without asking. It was the story of a woman who refused to accept the end, of a man who donated more than bone marrow, and of another who came back to life because someone refused to let him go. A true story, imperfect but deeply human, and for that reason, worth telling.